Welcome back, everybody, to another installment of On the Fly Lacrosse Podcast, casual conversations around coaching youth lacrosse. Very excited to introduce our guest this week, Sydney Scales. She's a two-time national champion at Boston College. She appeared at the national championship all 4 years of her college career and won her freshman and senior year. Walpole native, two-time ACC Defender of the Year, a current professional player in the WLL and also Team USA. So many, many more accolades to name, but we're really excited to have you here and talk about coaching youth lacrosse and some of the lessons that you've learned along the way, certainly as an athlete. And now that you are basically coaching full time alongside your playing career, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of little things we can pull out for coaches that are listening along. So first off, thank you for being here. And yeah, just want to kick it off with a little icebreaker question. Feel free to add anything that I missed to your bio that feels relevant. But just to get us started here around your coaching journey, when did you start coaching, and why does coaching, feel relevant for you? Why did you start coaching, and why is it important to you?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that intro, Marty. Thanks for having me on. Super excited to be able to help some youth coaches out, hopefully. I started coaching in a very informal setting around COVID, just kids in my backyard kind of thing, giving them some structure when there wasn't much going on. And then in a more formal setting, 24, I graduated college and took a role as an assistant coach with the Harvard women's lacrosse team, which I'm now in my second year of, along with starting my own lacrosse training company, Sydney Scales Lacrosse, which I'm still doing, which is a lot of group training, clinics, and all that. So super excited to be coaching. For me, I think the more that I dive into coaching, the more experience I get, the less it becomes about lacrosses and X's and O's, and the more it becomes about developing humans, developing kids, helping coaches develop. Because really, that's the most important thing, and that's what's going to transcend off the field and into everyday life. So for me, that's kind of my why. That's why I love doing it. And obviously, the competitive environment is something that I have always loved being around and always craved. But yeah, just really the development for me is something that's becoming more and more important.
It's a very fulfilling job, so we're lucky to be doing this.
Totally.
So as we get into this conversation around coaching, one thing that I think is super relevant for the situation you're in is like, you're coaching a college program and you're also coaching middle school girls and maybe even
hmm
younger and high school girls. And so what are some of the things that you kind of stay true to regardless of what age you're coaching? And then as a secondary, what are things that you sort of find yourself coaching towards or focusing on more so like with the youth groups in particular?
Yeah, totally. I would say something that we do with our college kids, but also I do with youth kids is, and obviously I'm sure a lot of coaches have heard this before, but is like the fundamentals, right? So like the fundamentals of lacrosse are dodging, 1v1 defense, stick work, making sure that we have all those and that we're always continuing to work on those is super important because you really can't do much else in lacrosse. You can't run an offense, you can't run a defense if you don't have those basic building blocks. I do that with all my kids, and then we even do that every year. Like a lot of our fall practices are just skill work, fundamentals, making sure that we're staying sharp with that, even at the college level, is super important. And then at youth, something that I try to focus a lot on, I would say, is definitely on the defensive side. I feel like a lot of kids have more of an offensive knowledge. It's just something that's naturally focused on more. So trying to bring in that defensive knowledge as well, even if you are, an attacker, say you're an attacker at a young age. I mean, I think we should learn both sides of the ball, but if you really think that's for you, you should still know what's going on defensively, right? So you can read a defense and anticipate. So, being able to instill that defensive knowledge and some of those tactics in the youth group is something that I've really been focusing on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And over the years, we've heard from a lot of coaches, and I've certainly seen this in my experience, where it's like you see the shooting and the dodging clinics, they're all over the place. You don't
Yep,
always see the defensive focus clinics, and
exactly.
it's so needed. And it's one of those skills where, regardless of what position you play, could be goalie, could be attack, you're a defender.
hmm
Everyone needs those skills to, approach and be able to cover the ball carrier as well as have an idea of what you're doing off the ball and spacing and timing.
Totally.
So yeah, appreciate that you're focusing on that. And I guess let's dive into that a little bit deeper. This is obviously something you're an expert in. Where do you start? If you're working with either an individual or a small group, let's, put it in the context of youth athletes. Where
Mhm.
do you start and, maybe what are you building towards?
Totally. One place that I always love to start because I think it is the foundation of defense and it is also where people struggle the most is just 1v1 defense. And what that kind of looks like is, I break it down into three parts. We have like first step, containing, and then keeping our attacker where we want them. And I really try to break each part down as specifically as possible and just work on that. So, we do a lot of just singular steps working on first step, those push to move steps. Then we progress into push to move into a run. Then we progress doing it with an attacker. We know they're going to the right, but let's just rep this out. Then we go to the left. Then we make it reactionary. So, really trying to have that progression so that kids can master a level before moving on to the next level is super important. That way they can build that really solid foundation, but also have confidence in what they're doing. Because, a lot of performance is feeling comfortable with it and knowing that you can do it so that you can go out there and execute.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what I'm hearing is, you're starting with kind of everyone's just focused on movements,
Hmm.
right? So you're talking about first step. I think you said lateral movements like turn and
Yep,
run.
totally.
You don't have to go over like each bullet point per se, but if I'm a coach listening along, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to get my athletes moving, thinking about, okay, here's my lateral shuffle and things like that. Then you're going into essentially partner work, or are those like
Hmm.
line drills where, like, let's say you've got a group of 20 kids, like, how do you progress from, the everyone's on the line and we're all kind of doing the same footwork to then what's that very next step from there for
Yeah,
you?
exactly. It's like you said, so we're all on the line, we're doing these movements without an attacker in front of us. Then the next thing I usually go to is add a partner, add that attacker, but you still know what they're doing. So, right, maybe it's, hey, we're going to do a split dodge to the right every time. So we're still working on those same movements. Now we just have the visual in front of us. And then usually the next step after that is making it reactionary, right? Because that's where kids are not thinking about what they're doing as much because they have to react to the attacker. So hopefully at that point we've built up enough muscle memory that they're able to take their mind off of it for a second, but still execute what they're doing.
Gotcha. Gotcha. If you put yourself in your childhood shoes, back to, let's say, what grade did you start playing lacrosse in Walpole?
Probably second,
Second grade. So pretty
unorganized, fourth
early.
grade organized.
All right. And so, in obviously many leagues, but certainly in our league in Mass Youth Lax, kind of particularly with the girls checking rules, it changes as they get older. And so for some of those younger girls and those coaches who are coaching the first to fourth grade girls, it feels very limited what you can do defensively because a
Mhm.
lot of it is kind of micromanaged and they don't want hard contact and things like that. So do you have any sort of advice for coaches that are trying to navigate, like, man, like, how do I teach defense to these young girls when if they put their hands on them the wrong way, they're always getting called for something? How do you,
Mhm.
as an athlete, how did you, navigate that? And now as a coach, how do you think about
Totally.
that?
Yeah, it's actually this is similar because recently, I don't know if you've been watching any college lacrosse, but they've tightened up the rules. So most times in women's lacrosse, like contact, shaft on shaft, any of that is a green card now. So we've actually had to have this very intense focus even at the college level in not having too much contact, not fouling. And a really simple thing that we do in a lot of drills is in a lot of these skill drills is we just don't use our stick, right? So we work on getting there with our feet, making sure that we're doing that. Another thing that I've seen is like using a pool noodle to start. Like you have a pool noodle, you can't really put a ton of pressure. Obviously, it's going to bend, but you still have an object in your hands that you're kind of working on using that, but mainly focusing on your footwork. And then the other thing that I've recently started doing kind of in small group training is just having the attack use like a soccer ball, honestly, instead of a lacrosse ball, because a lot of times at a young age, the limiting factor is stick work. And we still want to be able to learn concepts. So we just take the stick work out of it sometimes. I'll just have them pass around a soccer ball. We even used to do this at BC in college if we just didn't want to deal with having a turnover every few possessions and we really wanted to focus on defense. We just use that soccer ball, whether it's a 5v5 drill, which is this is something I did the other day in small group training. We just worked on defensive positioning. You're one pass away. How do you open up to the ball? The ball goes swings through X. Now it's on the other side of the field. How are you turning to the ball? And we just really want a quick ball movement to work on that positioning. So we just had the attack use a soccer ball. Defense, we don't have sticks, so we're focusing on footwork anyways. And it really just allows us to get a lot out of that drill.
It's a huge hack. I totally agree. I think it's helpful for even like the partner drills you mentioned earlier. It's like just take the ball out of the equation. You could have a stick in your hands. You could say, hey, tend to have a ball on your stick, but here's the dodge,
Exactly.
and we're not going to include the actual ball control as part of it because the offensive player is going to drop every third rep, what have you, especially for those younger girls and boys. Like we could just focus on the footwork here, but the only way to do that is to really just take the stick out of the equation, so you can, or just the ball out of the equation, or both, right?
Yeah.
Love the soccer ball idea. I've seen coaches use basketballs. I've seen coaches use footballs. It makes a lot of sense.
Yep. For sure.
And, one thing I'd love to kind of run by you and get your opinion on, this is something that I use as sort of a visualization tool for coaches when working on defense. And one of if I zoom out just a second, I tend to think about as I coach boys and girls game coaches, through high school, really. What are the through lines? That's kind of what I like. I start with what's true for everybody. And one of
Hmm.
the things that I found to be really helpful for coaches, and this goes all the way through for both genders, but super helpful in the context of when the rules are really tight around contact and things like that, is giving athletes the cue of, hey, you have your personal bubble. And if you're doing a partner drill, if the defensive player enters the offensive player's personal bubble, there's more of a chance to like get a call, get a penalty, right? And there's also the chance of like trying to make contact and almost getting yourself out of position.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're in good position defensively and you have your space, your personal bubble, and then the offensive player enters your space, then the contact happens, with your forearm as opposed to like a stick.
Hmm.
It's a lot cleaner. It's a lot easier for the ref to let that contact go. Does that make sense to you?
Totally. Yeah, that's something I phrase it like a similar way too. I always say you should always be letting your attacker come to you, right? They're trying to go to a place that you are between, right? You're between your attacker and the net. So you should never be moving at them. They can always come to you. And a lot of it too is just about getting that momentum in the same direction as that attacker, right? Just to make you less prone to fouling. And a lot of times I told my younger girls this, but didn't resonate as well because I don't think they're into football. But we tell our college girls on defense, like, watch a defensive back in football. Like, the defensive footwork is the same. You're backpedaling, then you're turning to run with them. That is like the exact same as up top defense. And that's exactly how we want you to play it. So you're not lunging at them into that personal bubble, like you said, Marty, and getting that foul.
Such a good point. So many things that we can pull from other sports into lacrosse, which is one of the greatest parts about this sport, right? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious to hear from you about, when you're working with a youth group in particular, how do you think about structuring your time? You can kind of zoom out, let's say on a weekly basis, maybe, and then also zoom into like one particular session. Most
Hmm.
of the youth coaches have two practices per week, 60 to 75 minutes per practice, and they may not have everybody at both practices, so maybe it's really only one practice per week that they kind of have their whole team. How do you think about structuring your time so that you're trying to obviously help them get better and have fun? You can't just be drilling fundamentals the whole time. So how do you break that down?
Yeah, definitely. I'll give you kind of two options too. So, when I'm doing skill work, kind of more in that small group setting, how I kind of like to break it up, we start quick warm up, then we do stick work, obviously essential for offense and defense. Then we'll go about 15 minutes of offensive work. And again, what I really try to do in these offensive defensive segments is do drills that simulate things that actually happen in a game. So, a lot of times, in the world of social media, I see people doing all these fancy drills on the internet, and there's definitely a time and place for that, but a lot of times those simple drills that are just mimicking, exactly the thing that was hurting you in the game or the thing that you need more confidence in is, the best way to go about that. So those are kind of the drills we're doing in that offensive segment. Then we'll usually do, for my younger kids, I'll do 5-minute competition, quick water break. Now we'll move into defense. Same thing. We'll take that game like drill that we saw, and then we'll do that for 15 minutes, and then we'll end with another competition. So that's more like the skill look. And now when we talk about college practices, which is more of like that team environment, less skill oriented. And again, this is like obviously high level, but it can apply to any age group, I think. Is, a lot of times, and again, these can look different based on scouting and opponents, but just a basic structure that I think is helpful to follow is same thing. Start little stick work, then we do a small sided drill. So maybe that's like a 3v2 or like something quick, army drill, if anyone knows what that is, some quick drill that's high energy to get things going. Then we'll move into, another small sided drill that's usually like more like building blocks of offense or defense. So like 1v1s, 2v2s, 3v3s, more even, but still building. And then we'll go, sometimes we'll split into units. So then we're doing defensive skill work, offensive skill work, come together, and we directly apply that skill work into a live setting. So I think that's really important, having that live setting directly after what you work
Right.
on. Because a lot of times if you do a 10-minute drill in between, like kids don't, they forget it or they're not applying it, right? So having that back to back has been something that we found to be super helpful. So those
Yeah.
are kind of just two different structures we use.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, keeping it fresh as you go into those game type reps. I wanna dive more into the competitions that you mentioned, but before we do that, if you think about your stick work phase of practice, and again,
Yeah.
really, really honing in on, let's say it's a 1st to 4th grade team, what does that look like? And then do you have, like, a ton of drills that you do, or is it like you got a couple go-tos and then you just kinda progress and regress as needed?
I would say, so to start with the latter question, I would say I have a good amount of drills that I go to, but honestly, the difference is the intention of the drill. So some of the drills are the same on paper, but to me, they're different because one drill we're focusing on, hedging, and the next drill we're focusing on off ball communication. So that's two different drills, right? Because we are doing the same thing, but with a different intent, it's going to look different and it's going to sound different. So that's a lot of what I do, is similar drills, like base drills, but with different twists, different intentions, different coaching cues. And I think, that's a good way to go about it, because then a lot of these girls, oh, they know this drill already. We don't have to spend 5 minutes making the learning about how to do the drill. Instead, we can spend that 5 minutes about how to execute in an offensive or defensive setting. And then for that stick work, like you mentioned, I would say that looks different every session, kind of based on the skills that we have. But I would say I have different drills that I go to based on what the skill level looks like. So if there's a huge discrepancy, then a lot of times that skill work will be, it might just be partner passing if we need to really pair people up, making sure, if there's two lower level people, perfect. That can even be post passing where one person's in the middle running back and forth between two people. And I can be, with the beginner group who needs the help. But honestly, the way that I found stick work to be like most beneficial is not necessarily the drill, but just how you're pairing people up and making sure that you have people of a similar skill together, whether that's like you only have two people, okay, we're gonna have to do partner passing today. Now you have four, okay, we can do a shape passing dodging drill. So just kind of taking the number of people you have at each level and then finding your drill based on that.
Got it. So, particularly in your stick work phase of practice, you're thinking, okay, here's my newer players. They're going to need more support. I'm actually going to keep them kind of together. You've got more advanced players over here. You're allowing them to be grouped together so they can kind of move quicker. Is that kind of your go to? And do you ever do
Yeah.
it differently, or do you stick with that?
For stick work, a lot of times we stick with that just because if I have someone who is super advanced and they're with someone who is struggling to catch, it's really like probably not going to be super beneficial for them. But I also will do the same drill, but just give people different progressions. So if we're doing partner passing, it's not going to be like everyone's catching right. Now we're all catching left. It's going to be like, hey, advanced kids, you're back of the stick righty. My other kids over here. All right, let's go right hand for double the amount of time because that's what you need. So kind of just giving those individual cues, and it doesn't have to be announced to the whole group, just kind of on the side, hey, now I want you to try sidearm righty. And then you walk down to the other group. Hey, all right, well, now we're going to do ground balls, whatever it may be.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And one of the things we've talked about in the past is like trying to avoid that, like, hey, advanced kids, like you guys do
Exactly.
this. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, that can rub some people the wrong way, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So, one of the biggest challenges in, let's say, that 1st to 4th grade group is keeping the kids engaged, making it fun and still making sure they get better at the fundamentals, right? And you mentioned that you do like some competitions, some fun things. So, yeah, what are some strategies you use to kind of gamify things, especially for the younger kids, as well as like just some straight up like fun competitions that, are go tos that kids seem to enjoy?
Totally. So, like, just to start off, I like try to make honestly any drill, whether it's like a competition drill or just like 1v1s, into a competition. And I think that partly stems from I'm a super competitive person, and I think that's what's really fun, but also, like, just thinking about, like, when I went to camps when I was younger, it was, like, always those really competitive drills, and when, like, a score was being kept, that was fun, and that, like, get you engaged and whatnot. So a lot of times we will just make things competition. And then another thing I do, and I just do this with my middle school athletes because at that age, half the game should be like having fun and making sure that you're not just getting burnt out before high school even starts. So after when we're switching gears into something, I try to end with a competition. So like if we have stick work and then we're going into offensive work, doing a quick competition. And then we're switching from offensive to defensive work. At the end of that defensive work, doing a competition. And a lot of times it can be great leverage too. It's like, oh, are we doing competition? Are we doing competition? It's like, all right, hey, I need you to pay attention to and really execute this for the next 5 minutes, and then we can do a competition.
Love it. Can you give me any specific examples of like, all right, you just did some stick work, you know, you're about to go into, an offensive focus station. Like, how do you end that stick work? What does that sound like?
Yeah, a lot of times for stick work, like we'll do just like progression. So it's like we're gonna go righty, lefty, two hands, one hand, bounce pass, end with like a trick, like some trick thing. And it's like, all right, you have 2 minutes to practice that progression, and now whoever gets it first. I would say stick work can be like a little more challenging. So sometimes I'll try to do drills that are not necessarily lacrosse skill based. So a lot of times, like some of our go tos are put a cone out, you're 20 yards away. All right, closest to the pin. We're trying to roll the ball as close as we can. We can do rounds or we can do one round, depending on, how long you want it to be. Another one can be just like balancing the stick on one finger. Who can do that the longest, right? Like different things like that. If we want to make it look more lacrosse based, sometimes I'll try to do like one more lacrosse based drill. So maybe that's like target shooting. All right, you hit the target, you're still in. You miss, just hop out to the side. And then doing another one that's a little bit less lacrosse, more just, a fun drill.
Love it. Love it. So similar question around gauging it to different levels. You've got your beginners, first or second year playing, don't have all the fundamentals down yet. You've got your club boys or girls that are kind of like rolling their eyes at the fundamentals because they think they're above it. And then you've got,
Hmm.
everyone in the middle. When you kind of progress practice along and now you're focusing on more applicable game type situations, one-on-ones, two-on-twos, uh, maybe transition, unsettled play, two-on-ones, three-on-twos, things like that. How do you think about that, difference in skill level once you get to more team-oriented stuff? Because you're forced to everyone kind of has to be together if you're,
Hmm.
coaching one team. So do you have any strategies for how you might communicate with one group versus the other, or maybe how you might like change the parameters of the drill as
Hmm.
needed? How do you think about
Yeah.
that?
No, definitely. And I think that's like what can be the most tough, regardless of what level you're coaching, is like when you have gaps and you're doing more unit based things and less skill based things. A couple things that I do is, one, certain groups, right? Like if we have more advanced people, we can put them into a group. That's what we do sometimes. But again, trying not to do that all the time because you do want to build chemistry with different people and you want, those kids who are maybe that second tier to be able to get to the first tier by playing with those higher level kids. So when it comes to that, like I said, sometimes we just change the parameters, like we take the stick work out of it. We use just a soccer ball, right? Taking out the things that are like, why is this drill not working? Is it because people can't catch and throw, or is it because the drill's too complicated? The drill's too complicated, then we make it more of a progression. So same way I was talking about skill work, starting with first step, then first step in running, same thing can be applied to unit drills, right? So we're probably not going to go right into two mans if we didn't even do 1v1s yet. We're probably not going to go right into doubling if we haven't talked about, you know, man down, because that's what backside offense is man down. So making sure that the same way there's a progression to skill work, there can be a progression to unit work and to building, that team chemistry by starting with those 1v1s, 2v2s, and then methodically building into, settled offense, settled defense, that kind of thing.
Got it. Got it. Makes a lot of sense. And when you kind of zoom out further and you think about a season, are you basing what you're doing at practice just on like, hey, I know week two, I always like to focus on this. Week three, I like to focus on this. How much do you incorporate like a structure of, you know, I know I need to focus on this early season, mid season, late season versus, well, this is how the game went. So this is what we're going to work on.
Yeah, I would say it's more like out of season versus in season. So like out of season, we're doing more of that skill work. We're doing more of like introducing things. So, like starting with 1v1s, then we'll go to 2v2s, then we'll introduce an offense, then we'll introduce a defense, so that when we get in season, we're not really we don't really have as much time to honestly focus on ourselves. Like we just played 3 games in 1 week. We are just talking about our opponent and scouting and taking what we know, what we did all fall, and now turning it and changing it based on that opponent and what the game plan is. So I'd say it's not as set of a structure in the spring. I would say it's a lot more out of season in the fall when we have that time to be able to focus on ourselves.
Got it. Now you're no stranger to coaching coaches. You know, you've had a couple years experience now. You're giving presentations at coach education trainings, giving presentations at the New England Youth Lacrosse Convention. You know, making content specifically, you know, geared towards coaches. And so, just curious to hear, you know, have you gotten any feedback as to like what are the drills or concepts that seem to be appreciated the most when it comes to what coaches, you know, enjoy learning from you?
Yeah, totally. I've definitely gotten a lot of good feedback just about the defensive drills. I go to like some youth practices sometimes and help out, and I think coaches just lack good drills to coach defense, honestly, because it's like you said, it's a lot of dodging and shooting and fancier drills, but just being able to introduce some of those really simple defensive drills. Whether it's one of my favorite is box 1v1s, where you set up a 5 by 5 yard box. The defender starts at the top of the box, attacker starts about 5-10 yards off. Attacker's trying to run all the way through the box, get through the bottom. The defender's trying to just force them out the side of the box. And they can have a stick, they cannot have a stick. But just simple drills like that are just ways to change it up instead of us doing, 1v1s around the net. Let's create these different boxes. Let's really make it a smaller environment so that kids can really hone in on those footwork details and make it, just something new and exciting for them. So I think those defensive drills have definitely been something that people have really been loving.
Yeah, and just creating that visual you just gave us is awesome. You know, having that parameter that's preset, and it's like if you just do one-on-ones in the open field, like it's almost too hard for the defense. There's too much space. You know, we don't
Totally.
really get the reps. Like when
Mhm.
you have that smaller space, you're able to get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 quality reps per player. And it's like, in that confined space, something's going to happen. It may not be super productive for the defender. Maybe they really
Yeah.
were way out of position, but the chance of actually having them, be in the right spot, or like they're almost in the right spot and they just missed it, or, they started to make contact perfectly and then they didn't have enough weight on the correct foot. So they
Mhm.
drop stepped at the wrong time. And it's like, well, now we can actually coach it because it's
Exactly.
confined and it's in that smaller space where you just don't have that chance if you just roll it out and do one-on-ones without creating some kind of lane or box or
Mhm.
parameter to confine that repetition.
Yeah, for sure, and that's something that we make a competition too, like, "Hey, count how many times you get through the box, count how many times you get them out the side," and then we'll do a, little semifinals and a finals. Like that's something we make a competition a lot of times, and it's also something that honestly can be more game like if you just do a 1v1, you have the whole 8 meter. Like that doesn't really happen in a game, right? Especially honestly at the youth level when people don't understand spacing as well. So being able to beat someone in a confined space or stop them in a confined space is almost more realistic to the game.
So, a lot of coaches want to know, how do I manage time at practice based on like game day execution?
Hmm.
Maybe not based on, but for game day execution. So, like when you think about maybe the role of coaching on the sideline of a game versus the role of coaching at practice, those are
Hmm.
two kind of very different things in a lot of cases. But, keep the question towards practice. Like, what do you feel like you need to do at practice before that first game? Like, how do you think about that? And like, you get 15 minutes to warm up before the game. Like, do you need to do that 15 minutes at practice? Or is that something that you can kind of change? Is that something that you keep consistent from game to game? How do you think about going from practice to game day coaching and what you prioritize?
Yeah, definitely. I would say like as you get to a higher level, you can kind of be more strict with how you go about your routine, whether that's like you have the same practice before a game is the same and warm up's the same. I think at the younger level, you don't have to be as strict with it, but I think still having some structure can definitely help, especially, as the stakes raise. Just being able to fall back on structure is super helpful. I think, before the day before a game, just being able to kind of review everything that's super important. So more of those unit based drills, less of the skill based drills, right? So making sure we're doing, we always do. We obviously have a scout team at a higher level, so we're doing defense versus scout offense. Then we're doing offense versus scout defense, man up, man down, and a fun competition to end. And I think, at the youth level too, if you have maybe 2 practices before a game, making that first practice could be more of that skill-based practice, working on things that you need to work on, things that you see in that last game that you want to fix. And then that second practice can be less skill, more, okay, what are we going to do in this game? You know what I mean? What is this team good at if we know that? Or, again, even reiterating just that stuff from last game that you want to change and not what you don't want your team to do, but what you do want them to do. So a lot of what we
Yeah.
talk about too is, directly after something happened, it can be, all right, we don't want to do that. That's fine. We want to get away from that. But the closer you get to that next game, changing that language more so to, hey, not we don't want to do this, but this is what we do want to do, right? Because especially at the youth age, kids don't always hear that don't word and they don't always hear that no word. They just are hearing everything else. So making sure that you phrase it as a, hey, let's do this, even if it's just to a singular player. If they shoot a shot, you don't want them to shoot. It's like, hey, instead of saying, hey, don't shoot this shot, it's like, hey, take this shot instead. And so I think that same concept can be applied to practices before games, focusing on what you do want your team to do so they can build that confidence going into that game, going into that warm up. And just to touch on warm ups again, I think at any level, warm up in a structured way can always be beneficial. Just touching on stick work is always important, a small sided drill. And then, I think the thing that's preference is just whether or not they want to do, those larger scale drills. Some teams like to do a full 7v7 before, some don't. But making sure that you end warm ups on a high energy note is super important to be able to then start the game on that same note.
Got it. So a lot of coaches have a group of athletes that are just such different personalities. And
Hmm.
one of the things that comes up all the time in these conversations on this podcast and just with coaches in general is how do we handle the like emotional side of what coaching is and kind of the psychology of like, man, like some of these kids, if I coach them in front of their peers, they kind of shut down. Or some kids, it's like I need to go and talk to them individually because that's just how I know they respond well. Or maybe it's like, this athlete's like awesome at practice, but then game day they're like super hesitant and they lose a little bit of their swagger. How maybe any stories for you in particular of like have there been any instances in your playing career where you had a bump in the road emotionally and something a coach did helped, or for you as a coach, maybe a story of like you were working with a player, you hit a bump in the road emotionally, and you found success through, doing what, saying what.
Totally. I think something that started as I was playing and then I tried to take into coaching was anytime our coaches were preaching something. This specifically was like as a captain. A lot of times when I was a captain at BC, we talked a lot about how people were acting when things weren't going well for them and how can we still be good leaders and good teammates when things aren't going well for us, because that's when it matters the most, right? Yes, it's easy to be a good leader when it's all sunshine and rainbows, but when there's adversity, how do you act? And I think just talking about that made you then have to do it, right? We couldn't sit in this room in a captain's meeting and talk about that if we weren't going to then go do it. And so the way that I kind of brought this into my small group training was I was noticing kids were having a lot of bad body language after mistakes, even just in these drills and training sessions where it's like a lot lower stakes than a game. So what we did is each week we have an emphasis on intangible. So again, the example of this was body language was the first thing we started with. We talked about it at the beginning of the session, and then we all throughout the session I would just call people out for good body language. So I wasn't, again, a lot of times at a young age kids aren't great with taking the criticism. There are some who are. And so if I know who those kids are, I will say something to them too if if they can handle it. But for those kids, hey, maybe this kid has never come to a session. I don't know how they're going to react. We'll just call it the positive body language. And then all the kids were trying. It was almost to a point where it was like make a mistake and it's like really smiling because now everyone wants to be acknowledged for the good body language. And so even if they're faking it, it's like, okay, well, if we just keep doing this, it's eventually going to become probably more habitual for them. And then at the end of the session, just like giving shout outs to those people. Hey, this girl had really great body language today, or hey, she made a mistake in the drill. And then look at she turned it around the next drill and was able to get out of it. Like that is like acknowledging those things is really all that kids want. And again, it goes back to just saying, what you do want to see versus what you don't want to see.
It's a great example of what you talked about earlier. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I just so often see, and I make this mistake all the time. Is like you see something that you don't like, and it's like, "Ooh, I got to call that out."
Totally.
And there are times for that, right? And
Mhm.
I think if you've got the consistency factor of what you're talking about, of like, hey, every time I see body language, or as often as I can when I see positive body language, I'm gonna, encourage that and give props to that. And then there's gonna be a ripple effect. I think that as a base strategy is like way better than I'll just call out what I see when I see it, because we naturally are going to notice those things that we don't like, and
Yeah.
that can't be our only note, right, as coaches.
Definitely. And then I think it makes, you've called someone out positively 3 times in a row. If you do have to call them out negatively, it's like, well, you've already built up a bit of this cushion, a bit of this relationship for them to have a better response than if you hadn't done that 3 times positively to start with.
Love it. All right, so we'll start heading towards wrapping this up here. Before we do, just want to get like, what's your favorite drill or game that you like to do? What gets
I would say one of my favorite drills is True North. So, 2 teams at BC, we used to split it up private versus public school, so it would be very intense because people take that very seriously. Um, and, one team starts up top on the 12-meter, you have 4 lines spread out along the 12-meter. Other team has 3 lines behind the net. Throw the ball down to the team behind the net, so the first person in each line steps out, and then the first people in the 2 inside lines up top go down. So it's a 3v2. Play that out. There's a goal or turnover. The 2 people in the outside lines up top add in, right? So those 2 people in the middle lines were the defenders. 2 people on the outside lines add in. And now offense goes to defense goes to offense, and it's a 4v3. And then halfway through the drill, you can switch it. So the team that was up top in 4 lines is now behind in 3 lines and vice versa. And just making it competitive, keeping score, some good old like chirping in there. Never hurt anyone. I'd say that's definitely one of my favorites.
Love it. True North is one of my favorites as well. So good answer. All right. So where can we send people to find what you're working on? I know obviously you got the small group training going. You're busy in season with college coaching, but what else are you working on, and where can we send people to find?
Yeah, totally. Sydney Scales Lacrosse.com has all my info. We do small group trainings year round, and we're actually super excited to be launching an online platform, hopefully around the start of March, just to be able to give kids more personalized training, not only in person, but also outside, and really focus on that developmental piece. So, not just the X's and O's, but also goal setting, athlete development, really trying to make it a holistic thing. So, that's something we're super excited about. And anything we release, we always pop it up there on our website. So definitely check that out for anything that we offer.
Love it. And I'll include those links. And I also just want to give a shout out, at Mass Youth Lax is partnering with Sydney as well. And we've
Yes.
also got some content that we already recorded. I was able to come out and watch one of your sessions, and we recorded some stuff that I think is going to be helpful for coaches. And also, you did mention this very briefly, but you can potentially be dropping in and visiting some youth practices, depending how your
Mhm.
schedule goes. So if that's of interest to anyone listening out there, please reach out and we can see if we can line that up. But
Totally.
Sydney, thank you so much. Appreciate what you're doing. Appreciate your expertise, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you and play speed lax with you, and just catch up in general. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Appreciate what you guys are doing to grow the game and happy to be a part of it.
All right. Thanks to all the listeners out there. Thanks to Mass Youth Lax for powering this. Thanks everybody. See you next week.